As noted, this is the last fireside chat of the academic year. Who here is a firstie? Raise your hand. I mean, I didn't say cheer. I just wanted to see hands. Like, how many days till you graduate? Is that? Too many. I like that answer. Too many. All right. So again, welcome. These fireside chats are help us explore the annual intellectual theme, which is this year's Innovation, Technology, and the Future of National Defense. The guest today needs no introduction. It's my good friend and old boss, General McMaster. He has clearly a reputation for being an innovative thinker and an expert in national security issues. I'm going to read you just a bit on his bio, and then we'll get going, I promise. But it's important. So, General McMaster graduated. Anyone know where he graduated from? That's right, the United States Military Academy. Come on, give me a round of applause. Thank you. It's not even hard. It wasn't even a hard one. He went on to serve as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years. He retired as a lieutenant general in June 2018 after serving as the National Security Advisor. From 2014 to 2017, he designed the Future Army as the Director of Army Capabilities Integration Center and the Deputy Commanding General Futures of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command. As a commanding general at the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, he oversaw all training and education for the Army's infantry, armor, and cavalry force. He's commanded organizations in both peacetime and war, including a combined joint interagency task force in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012, as well as the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq from 2005 to 6, and Eagle Troop 2nd ACR in Operation Desert Storm from 1990 to 1991. Among his many awards includes a Silver Star, which he received for actions in the First Gulf War as he commanded a tank company during the Battle of 73 Eastings. General McMaster has a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has authored a number of best-selling books, one titled Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, and Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. He has lots of essays, articles, and book reviews on leadership, history, and the future of war, and they've appeared in pretty much every publication you can imagine. Distinguished Fellow at Arizona State University, a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and a lecturer at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. And I would tell you that you can look at it from either perspective. I had the great fortune, and maybe he had the great misfortune, I got to work for him as a lieutenant, as did my brother. So that was an incredible opportunity for both of us from the Reeves family. But perhaps most importantly, and most impressively, he was an assistant professor in the great Department of History at the United States Military Academy. So, the way I wanted to start this is, he thinks we're going to start with some questions, but actually I do have a question. What we were able to find, it's pretty good, is the actual letter he sent to come here and teach, okay? Wow. Now, I know, it's pretty good. So he actually wrote this letter to the Department of History in March 1991, shortly after ending the end of combat operations in Operation Desert Storm while he was in command of Eagle Troop. There's so many good lines in this thing. I'm going to post this online immediately after this, so everybody can read this, okay? So just a couple of things I would like to notice about this letter. The handwriting is beautiful. Anyone here a psychology major? What does that mean about him? I don't know. This is beautiful handwriting, but here's something, a couple of highlights for you. So he talks early on, and let me quote him. He said, "I found that much of my reading of military history applied to this particular campaign," talking about his time in combat in Operation Desert Storm. He said, "General Harman's notes on the Tunisian campaign and Rommel's papers applied most directly." If that's not like the best advertisement ever for the teaching of history and reading of history for officers, I don't know what is. I also love this line, because I am an old armor officer. He says, "I really loved how our officers, NCOs, and soldiers fought as a team and behaved like veterans in their first major battle." Remember, he's writing to the department head to come here and teach. He said, "We assaulted the enemy position with tanks leading. We assaulted the enemy position with tanks leading," twice. "The scouts initially provided a base of fire, then moved behind the tanks to protect the flanks and rear." This is my favorite part. "The enemy felt the full shock effects and firepower of armor." I mean, like, boom, drop it. Like, who didn't go armor? Bad idea, right? That's awesome. So, I mean, that really doesn't get any better if you're an armor officer than that. But I just wanted to start with some questions. You're not here to listen to me. You're going to hear from General McMaster. And I will tell you, of all the great leaders I've known in my life, you don't find many that are this honest, this direct, and this pointed, and I appreciate that. And we're going to have a very honest and direct conversation tonight about things that you're going to need to know very, very soon, but also some things that maybe you don't know. And so let me just start with the first question, sir. You wrote an article in 2021 that was published in the National Review titled Preserving the Warrior Ethos, where you make the observation that the warrior ethos is at risk. So can you just explain what you mean by warrior ethos?
Okay, great. And thanks, Joe Reeves. What a blast it is to be with my old Lieutenant Reeves here, who was fantastic as an officer at that level and just fun as hell to be around. And his brother was extremely courageous in combat as well. And the next Reeves is about to be commissioned here and carry on that tradition. But hey, what a privilege it is to be with all of you. I just want to say before we even start, thank you for volunteering to serve our nation at a critical moment. We'll talk maybe a bit about this. But I do think that we are in a period of really significant danger in that our adversaries around the world are coming together. They're cooperating more. And they're challenging us in ways that I think are going to lead maybe to a cascading of crises that we already see ongoing, cascading further. So our nation is certainly going to need you to lead our soldiers in combat. And it's really humbling to be with all of you. Thank you for the privilege. And so important to us to be able to fight and win in wars, I think more than any other kind of feature of our profession, is our warrior ethos. And I would describe our warrior ethos as a covenant that binds us to one another in our profession, and a covenant between us and the society, our country, and the citizens in whose name we fight and serve. And the ethos is what we expect of one another based on the principles, the values that we know are essential to combat effectiveness. That's certainly your sense of honor, right? Because as John Keegan said in the Face of Battle, that battle is about the struggle of men and women trying to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation with the achievement of some aim over which others are trying to kill them. So your sense of honor, what that means is, hey, I am more worried, more fearful of letting you down on either side of me than I am of the enemy or what might happen to me. Your sense of honor, your courage, your commitment to the mission and to the man or woman next to you. And then also, certainly, your willingness to sacrifice for one another. Being part of a team in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. And in good units who are bound together by that ethos, they take on the quality of a family, you know. And you're bound together by common purpose, mutual trust, and really affection. That's our warrior ethos, and I think it's at risk, as I mentioned in this essay.
Sir, why do you think it's at risk?
It's at risk, I think, in part because popular culture cheapens and coarsens the warrior ethos. If you look at popular culture, I'm talking about video games and movies and so forth, they really don't do anything to help you understand the warrior's calling. What brings you to that profession? What brings you to want to be part of an organization that is committed to those principles? Also, I think that there's a tendency in popular culture to portray veterans, for example, as traumatized, fragile human beings. Those who don't understand our military, understand our commitment to excellence and to one another, they tend to sort of feel sorry for the military and not recognize the tremendous rewards of service. I mean, as you know, soldiers, we don't want to be pitied. Who wants to be pitied, right? And so I think that this misunderstanding puts a strain on that covenant between what society expects of us and what we expect from our society. But it also, I think, can put some strain on you, or those who are thinking about serving, because they don't really understand the rewards of service, right? And those rewards are less tangible, harder to understand, right? It's easy to understand, long times away from your family and having to make sacrifices, or the worst, to see somebody who you care about, who you love, killed in combat. But the rewards have everything to do with what you achieve in protecting our nation. And I believe that our warriors, all of you, are warriors and humanitarians, both. Because it's you that stands between, really, our fellow citizens and those who would do us harm. And we've seen this time and time again from 9/11, certainly in our most recent careers. But you saw that for the Ukrainians, right? And how they have to rely on their warriors. Or how about the Israelis after the heinous attacks of October 7th? So anyway, I'm concerned about it. There are other reasons I'm concerned about it. Maybe we can talk about as well.
Sure, sir. And one thing that you note in the article is that some may say, well, technology means that the warrior ethos is perhaps, it's not as necessary. Or that potentially a state, an advanced state like the United States, could opt out of conflict. Why do you think those are incorrect assumptions?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like to paraphrase, Trotsky, I mean, you may not be interested in war, but war's interested in you, right? And as the philosopher G.K. Chesterton said, war's not the best way of settling differences, but it's the only way to ensure they're not settled for you, right? And this is what some people who don't understand a profession like you do, who aren't warriors like you are, they think, wait, why don't the Ukrainians just cut a deal with the Russians, just give up? But from the Ukrainians' perspective, the cost of a ceasefire is much higher than continuing the fighting because their survival is at stake. And so it's important to understand that wars choose you oftentimes than the other way around. The second thing is in terms of technology. As I look at history and military history, and I usually I do that in the way that Sir Michael Howard, the great historian, recommended we study history in width, depth, and context, right? You study history in width so you can understand, hey, changes that happen, right, over time. Different technologies, different forms of warfare. Warfare evolves the character of warfare. But the nature of war remains consistent. So studying war in width allows you to see continuities and changes, right? The historian Carl Becker said, memory of past and anticipation of future should walk hand in hand in a happy way, without one disputing primacy over the other. And what you will find when you're sensitive to continuity and change is that new forms of warfare typically don't replace the old one. They're usually grafted onto the old ones. And there, really, there are two fundamental ways to fight: asymmetrically and stupidly. This is what our historian colleague Conrad Crane pointed out years ago. You hope the enemy picks stupidly, like Desert Storm, Saddam Hussein. It was like we called them out onto the schoolyard and beat them up with our asymmetrical advantages. Others have learned from that. And so whatever you think your major differential advantage is, right? Surveillance capabilities, big data analytical tools, and other forms of artificial intelligence, long-range precision strike, there are traditional countermeasures to that. Dispersion, concealment, intermingling with civilian population, deceptions. Right now we have the ubiquity of drones. Hey, well, counter-drone warfare is going to catch up. Right? In warfare, you have the machine guns decisive. Well, then you have the tank. But then you have the anti-tank missile. You have the submarine, the sonar. Remember, the bomber's always going to get through. Oh, radar, right? So it's this continuous interaction that limits the impact of any kind of range of technologies. And ultimately, it's those continuities in the nature of war that I think result in the fact that wars still resemble each other more than they resemble any other human activity. This is another observation of Michael Howard. And so what are continuities in the nature of war? Okay, this is a quiz for the firsties really quick. Okay, war's an extension of politics. You're like, okay, well, everybody knows that. That's like the Geico commercial, man. Everybody knows that. Clausewitz said that. But what that means is that you have to get to a sustainable political outcome that brought you into the war to begin with. So the consolidation of military gains, that's never been optional in war. The second is that war is human. People fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. And unless what you're doing militarily addresses those drivers of conflict, you're not going to be successful in achieving the outcome you want in war. Third, war is uncertain. And this is really important because if you buy into the narrative that you hear today, or we heard the same stuff in the 90s when Steve and I and others were teaching here, hey, really, the next war will be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. Because now we have satellite capabilities, precision strike capabilities, assured communications, big data analytics. That makes what they called at the time the revolution in military affairs. Future war would be fast, cheap, efficient, waged at standoff range. Our forces could be lean and nimble. So there were all these assumptions were made in the 90s, and it was a setup for many of the difficulties we encountered in Iraq and Afghanistan, I believe, wars during which we took a short-term approach to long-term problems and actually lengthened those wars, made them more costly. And finally, war's a contest of wills. That's true at the national level, and I think we, in large measure, defeated ourselves with the end the endless wars mantra. But war's a contest of wills at the tactical level, back to that disintegration of human groups. And it's our ethos and our commitment to one another, the cohesion that we have in units, that allows us to create a bulwark against fear, a bulwark against that disintegration. Because we want to disintegrate the other human group, right, with our confidence in one another and our military prowess, our ability to fight together as a team.
Sir, if there is a new dynamic that has probably, started to fill some important spaces when it comes to warfare, it's information and social media, and so the Israelis, for example, there's an argument to be made that they could actually win the ground in Gaza, but lose the information campaign. How do you see information affecting so much of this?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important question, a really important point. To win, right? To win, you want to defeat your enemy. Defeating your enemy, again, going back to Clausewitz, right? Winning, according to Clausewitz, is convincing your enemy that your enemy's been defeated, right? That convince your enemy they can no longer pursue their objectives through the use of force. That means physical defeat of the enemy, but it's also psychological defeat and winning on the battleground of perception. And I think we all have to think about, how do we do that? When we conducted, obviously I'm not making an analogy between counterinsurgency in Iraq and Gaza, there are so many different factors involved. But we said, okay, for us to win here, for us to be able to defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq and establish a new political and security order that leads to sustainable security and stability that is fundamentally hostile to these jihadist terrorists, we have to win on the battleground of perception by doing three really critical tasks. We have to clarify our intentions. We have to counter enemy disinformation and propaganda. And we have to trace the grievances of the population back to those who created those grievances. In the situation in Tel Afar, which is kind of maybe analogous to Gaza, al-Qaeda in Iraq was committing mass murder, for example, murdering people, and then blaming people other than themselves for their own murderous act. Well, it's that Iraqi government security forces, but they were the ones doing the murdering people. Also, what was critical in this connection was to clarify all the grievances. Hey, we don't have basic services. Well, whose fault is that? Al-Qaeda in Iraq is killing the drivers of the trucks that are supposed to bring clean water. Hey, our government in Baghdad, they don't represent us. Well, did you vote? No. Why? Well, if we went to the polls, we'd be killed. Okay, whose fault is that, right? So it's important, I think, to peel this back. In the case of Gaza, Hamas is an organization that took over by force in 2005 in Gaza. It immediately began diverting any kind of assistance that was meant for the Palestinian people into its terrorist capabilities and its terrorist infrastructure. Diverted tens of billions of dollars away from the population into that terrorist capability. This is an organization that, unlike us, right, what's our job? To protect the American people, to protect our citizens. What is Hamas's strategy? In part, their strategy is to get as many Palestinians killed as they can, right? I mean, what did they think was going to happen after October 7th? And Hamas is an organization that is not only victimizing their own people, but they're perpetuating their suffering. I wish that the Israelis, or maybe they did and it didn't get aired, had done like an equivalent of the lifestyles and the rich and famous of Hamas leaders, living in their five-star hotels in Qatar, but how about their mansions, their villas on the Mediterranean coast? And then quick cut to deprivation in Gaza. So, I do think that there could have been much more done on the battleground of perception, and as well to protect innocents in the context of the operation that had to be conducted in very dense urban terrain against an organization that's using the population as human shields.
So this is too good. I'm going to come back to the war ethos, but I have to stay on this thread for a second. Do you believe that the Hamas attack on October 7th was orchestrated by the Iranians with a particular goal of trying to stop the normalization of relations between the Israelis and the Arab states, in particular Saudi Arabia?
Okay, so yes, this was orchestrated, planned, prepared by the Iranians, and it was in part due to trying to break the possibility of the normalization of relations with the Saudis and others. But I don't think that was the principal goal. I think the principal goal was to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. I mean, I think when we listen to when these authoritarian dictators, terrorist leaders, like Ayatollah Khamenei, the head of the theocratic dictatorship in Iran, when he says what he wants to do, I think we should take him at his word, and I think what you've seen over the years, since the early 1980s, probably even going back to 79, 80, is that Iran has established and has been pursuing what it calls a forward defense strategy, but it's really a forward offense. Certainly after the Iran-Iraq war, they said, okay, we don't want a disaster war like on our borders again, so let's come up with a strategy that allows us to expend every Arab and Palestinian life, right? They don't give a damn in pursuit of their objectives. And one of their critical objectives is to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. Now, the way that they want to do that is they want to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict. To do that by creating militias that lay outside of the government's control, that can be turned against that government if that government acts against Iranian interests, right? This is the Hezbollah model. This is what they have, in Iraq with the Hashd-e-Shaabi militias. This is what they have in Yemen with the Houthis. And their support of Assad is similar in that they perpetuate the cycle of sectarian violence to keep the Arab world perpetually weak, and they can extend their hegemonic influence throughout the region. They can also use those proxies for step A, which is push us out of the region as the first step in isolating and destroying Israel. Around Israel in particular, they have established the Ring of Fire strategy or capability with a number of proxies, including Hezbollah, which has about 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel, some of them retrofitted with precision kits. You have a proxy army that Iran is forming on Israel's border in Syria. Many of them are being recruited from Afghanistan or from Iraq. You have obviously Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Some of them are in Lebanon too. Hamas has been active in Lebanon recently, but in Gaza and in the West Bank primarily for those two groups. So I think Iran has activated this Ring of Fire. The only reason Iran is holding back on Hezbollah is that that's its main deterrent to try to prevent Israel from striking Iran's nuclear and missile facilities directly with conventional force. So that's why they're holding back. But what happens next, I'll say quickly, Israel must go into Rafah. There's no option other than that. I mean, I can't believe we're advising them not to go into Rafah. I mean, your mission is to destroy the enemy, but you're just going to leave their leadership there? You're just going to allow them to reconstitute later? You can't do it. Now, can you do that in a way that minimizes risk to civilians? Yes, they should force Hamas to release as many civilians as they can into areas that are already cleared by Gaza. And it would be nice if the Egyptians opened up some way of egress temporarily so they can get out of harm's way. That would be nice. So put pressure on that, provide as much humanitarian assistance. Rafah is going to happen, I think, in the next couple of weeks. You see it, it's already initiated. Then I think if you're Israel, what do? What's the lesson of Gaza? Don't allow a hostile terrorist organization that is determined to destroy you to be on your borders with significant capabilities. I think by the end of the summer, there's going to be an offensive into southern Lebanon. And maybe to the depth of maybe 20 kilometers, and a destruction of Hamas's infrastructure in southern Lebanon, and maybe an extended occupation of southern Lebanon. What happens next? What happens next, I think, is the Ring of Fire might get activated completely with other proxies, as we've seen, with the missile launch. Maybe there's direct attacks from Iran, but I think it's only a matter of time that Iran, before Israel strikes Iran's nuclear facilities and missile facilities.
So I have another follow-on question.
Job security for you.
Yeah, again,
all of you.
Good job. Sir, I'm getting back to the warrior ethos, but I have to follow up with this question. You say that when we have an autocrat say something, we should listen to him. So Chairman Xi has said, I'm going to Taiwan on my watch. He's 70 years old. Is he going?
Yes, he's going. And what he would prefer to do, Xi Jinping would prefer to achieve annexation of Taiwan through invitation. And so I think what we are likely to see in the coming months, maybe a couple years, is increasing coercion and subversion against Taiwan. In some of the tried forms that they've used, disinformation, propaganda, various forms of political subversion, but also coercion with maybe soft blockades, with economic coercion, with buying off of elites with bribes and so forth. So I don't think that's going to work with Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan has learned vicariously through the fate of Hong Kong when human freedom was extinguished there. And so what does Xi Jinping do next? He's preparing for war, and I think we have to see not only what he said on certain occasions, but the pattern of his speeches that he gives that oftentimes are only declassified, a year later or something. In one of these speeches that Matt Pottinger highlighted, and I recommend reading anything he writes, including the recent co-authored essay in Foreign Affairs, as well as another great essay by Liz Economy on Xi Jinping's intentions with his 5 big initiatives, including the Global Security Initiative, which if that isn't concerning, how about the Global Civilization Initiative? Who wants to sign up for that program? So essentially, what Xi Jinping is doing is becoming more and more aggressive in trying to establish really an exclusionary area of primacy across the Indo-Pacific. And that includes the South China Sea, where they are attacking the navy of a treaty ally of the United States, the Philippines. And they're laying claim to the ocean. Hey, nobody owns the ocean, but they're laying claim to it. And then, of course, the coercion of Taiwan. So in this speech, Xi Jinping likens what he might have to do to Taiwan to Mao's actions in Korea, which they call the War of American Aggression, right? And he says in the speech that Mao delivered 1 blow to prevent 100 blows. So he portrays Chinese intervention attack in Korea as preemptive, because he was being surrounded, and so then he talks about Taiwan. So it sounds very familiar to Putin's argument about the invasion of Ukraine, right? This idea that they're beleaguered, they're encircled, they might need a preemptive action and so forth. And he said, we will have to sacrifice. There are going to be sacrifices by the Chinese people to achieve the vision of national rejuvenation and the Chinese dream. That sounds to me like, and there are also physical preparations. Since the year 2000, Chinese military spending has increased 45-fold. Though much of that has gone into 3 tiers of capabilities. Tier 1 would be the conventional capabilities that were necessary for a cross-strait invasion, right? Think helicopters, landing ships, and so forth. How about a massive field hospital they're building, not field hospital, military hospital, right across the strait from Taiwan? Gee, I wonder what that could be for, right? Then the second tier are things to keep us at bay, right? Tiered and layered air defense, long-range strike capabilities, electromagnetic warfare, counter-satellite, offensive cyber. And the third is a massive increase in their strategic nuclear forces. And I believe they could possibly be trying to generate a first strike capability. You remember the balloon, right? Gee, I wonder what the balloon was doing over the Dakotas, and then drifting over Norfolk. I wonder what the previous balloon was doing on the West Coast near San Diego. I mean, they're looking at strategic sites to gather communications intelligence that can't be gathered from other means of collection. And so I think all of this is concerning, So what does that mean for us? I think what that means for us is take it seriously. I believe we have to invest more in defense. We should be spending, I think, about 4% of our GDP on defense. Capacity matters in terms of deterrence. But how do you deter China? You deter China with real capabilities. Helping Taiwan become indigestible, but then forward positioning capable U.S. forces that are capable of operating for ample duration and in sufficient scale to defeat the enemy. So that's what I think we have to be focused on. Hard power matters, right? Nobody's afraid of integrated deterrence, right? That sounds like pixie dust to me. What they're afraid of is real hard power.
So I'm going to bring it back down. You mentioned in the article taking risks as being part of the warrior profession, and that risk aversion robs warriors of their agency. Do you think the Army is too risk adverse?
Well, I don't know, right? I'm a washed up general chilling out at Stanford. You know what I mean? Trying not to go too soft. But I think all of us can manage risk at your levels, within your platoon, within your company, within your battalion. And what I would emphasize to our soldiers and leaders is that the riskiest course of action is oftentimes to not act. And for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a tendency at times, not always, but at times, for units to consolidate on big bases, and to think that that's good for force protection. Well, meanwhile, what is the enemy doing? The enemy is intimidating the civilian population so it can have freedom of movement through civilian populations, gather and marshal the resources to accomplish their objectives, and then ultimately to attack you as you commute to the war, right? You can't commute to war. What seems risky would be to have small patrol bases all through a city or in a rural area and develop relationships with the population, but that's actually much less risky. When we were teeing up options for President Trump in March of April, first week in April of 2017, after Syrians had committed mass murder of innocents using the most heinous weapons on earth, nerve agents, killed hundreds of people, including scores of children. One of the pieces of advice that I gave him was that previous administrations, with the unenforced red line in Syria, if you remember that, 2013, 2014, had been sort of captured by, frozen by, immobilized by the risk of action. But what we're seeing then, I suggested to him, were the risks and costs of inaction, and that when we considered the risk of attacking the Khan Shaykhun airfield and destroying the aircraft that conducted those attacks, we should balance that against the risk of inaction, and maybe that including the normalization of chemical weapons again, on the 100-year anniversary of the banning of chemical weapons after World War I. That would be a really bad thing for the world.
All right, sir. So speaking of risk-taking, withdrawals are often considered the most risky of all military operations, along with amphibious landings, which is, again, good for us with China and Taiwan. There's some risk there for them. But can you talk about the U.S.'s withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, just from your perspective and impacts that you've seen?
Okay, this is another reason why I think the warrior ethos is at risk. And I would, first of all, love to hear some of your thoughts on this and everything. It's very painful for those of us who served in Afghanistan to see what happened in Afghanistan. And I think that this has lent itself to more strain on the warrior ethos, but also maybe a degree is a part of the problem with our recruiting efforts. I believe that militaries should be committed to win, right? I mean, I am sympathetic with General MacArthur on this, right, that there's no substitute for victory. And, that's really the case for a very practical reason. In war, each side tries to outdo the other. And if you don't go into war trying to win, you're ceding the advantage to your enemy, who then is able to escalate and everything with impunity and keep you on the defensive and seize the initiative from you, which is always what you don't want in war. You want to be the one with the initiative, have the enemy reacting to you. I would like to bring the word win back into the lexicon, and I think that's what we lost sight of in Afghanistan. Remember, we kept hearing these kind of tropes, right? Oh, there's no military solution in Afghanistan. Well, the Taliban came up with one, didn't they? And so, I think it's really important for us to maintain that commitment. I'll tell you one quick anecdote, if I can. I was commander of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. We went into an area that was an al-Qaeda stronghold. It was a training base for al-Qaeda. They wanted to hold on to it, which gave us the opportunity to kill and capture large numbers of them, for which I was grateful. But when we went into this area, we briefed our higher headquarters because we were new. We conducted reconnaissance, as you would expect a cavalry unit would do, to gain visibility of the enemy, to map the enemy, to identify their sources of strength and support, their physical sources of strength and support, but also, as we alluded to earlier, their psychological and informational sources of support, and to put together a strategy for defeating the enemy. So I briefed my division and corps commanders on our mission statement. The 3rd United States Cavalry conducts combined area security and counterinsurgency operations in our area and builds Iraqi security forces to defeat the enemy in our area of operations and set conditions for sustainable security and stability. So I had 2 senior officers say, what is this word defeat? Why are you defeating the enemy? We didn't ask you to do that. We asked you to transition, which I'd liken to a flaming bag of feces strategy. Just hand the Iraqis a flaming bag of feces and get out the door. I mean, how the hell is that in our interest, right? So I explained, okay, hey, we have the enemies of all civilized people here. This is Al-Qaeda. They want to kill our children. We have a strategy. We have an approach that I think will allow us to win the war, to defeat the enemy in our area of operations. And, we did come all this way, So while we're here, why don't we just knock it out? So when I didn't get promoted to Brigadier General, it was not really that much of a mystery. You know what I mean? For a couple of promotion boards. But that was my attitude. We had lost 2 soldiers that day. We had lost Lieutenant Rubidoux and Sergeant Martinez. 2 fantastic. All of our soldiers, so fantastic, And so how do you not owe it to them to win, right? I think the ultimate test of a strategy, the ultimate test of the plan you put together for your tactical operation is if you can explain to your soldiers how the risks that they may take and the sacrifices they may make will contribute to an outcome worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. And an outcome that's worthy of that does not sound like responsible end to me.
Sir, I have one last question, then I'm going to turn it over to the cadets, so get some questions going. So, and the cadets in the audience, they get this, they're aware. They're aware of the challenges which are going to face them in the very near future. What would you say is the biggest challenge you see for them coming up next, let's say, in their time in the Army?
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge is that wherever you're going to be, you're going to have to maybe fight outnumbered and under-resourced, which typically is not our thing. You know what I mean? It's not our thing. And I think one of the reasons you may be under-resourced and outnumbered, and you don't ever want this, by the way. Hey, there is kind of a streak of stoicism in parts of our Army, especially our light infantry, man. I love light infantry, you know what I mean? But, the automotive revolution happened, you know what I mean? But the other thing is, there is this idea that you just want to get in a scrap, small arms to small arms bayonet. No. When in doubt, bump up, right? So you can have a 14-hour firefight back and forth, or you can give a fire command. Gunner, heat, machine gun, and then destroy the machine gun and have a snack. You know what I mean? So, what you want is smoking boots on the other end of a tactical engagement, right? So that we can do that because even if you win a fair fight, it's still ugly on the end. You don't want fair fights, but I think you're going to be in some fair fights, and the reason is, and I hope maybe this changes, that we have been lightening up in a lot of our combat enabling capabilities. Not as bad as the Marine Corps. Got rid of their tanks and artillery. Wow, okay. So how does that make sense? Because what I believe that close combat and close combat overmatch will be more important in future war even than it has been in the recent past. Now you might say, well, how is that true? Because we have drones and FPV drones. We have artificial intelligence. We have all these nifty things we can do in cyberspace. We've got, but I'll tell you, Clausewitz said that all mistakes are bad in war, but the mistakes that come from kindness are the worst. And by kindness, he meant the belief that you think that the battle is going to be anything but bloody and desperate and depend on your toughness, your courage, your stamina, your confidence in one another. Don't think that's not going to be the case. That's what it's going to depend on. And the reason is, again, there are countermeasures for everything. Right? For drones, there are going to be direct energy capabilities, electromagnetic warfare. About 30 drones are lost by the Ukrainians every month, in Ukraine. And so war is this continuous interaction of opposites, and it's going to come down to close combat. You know why? Because the outcome of war depends on the control of territory, populations, and resources. And it always comes down to that. You might say, well, we just need these maritime capabilities or aerospace capabilities. Yes, you need them. Hell, I would never want to go to war without the United States Air Force or Navy, Marine Corps, anybody. But when it comes down to it, it comes down to the control of territory, population, resources. Where do all the problems originate that manifest themselves in the aerospace and space and cyberspace and maritime domains? They start on land. Unless we go to war against the dolphins, it's on land. And so, I think that we can't kid ourselves. Close combat overmatch. And by that I mean the physical capabilities, the combined arms capabilities that can be brought to bear by all domains in support of your fight, right? But it has so much to do with psychological and overmatch associated with the confidence you have in your ability to fight together as a team. We have this idea that you can sprinkle units around and that will deter an enemy. It's not going to deter an enemy. I look at deployments of 100, 200, 300 soldiers. I'm like, how about 30,000? If we're really serious about it. So I think because of this idea that we can send messages with military force, instead of demonstrate the capability to fight and win is the way you deter, I think that's going to potentially get you in a dangerous situation. And just prepare for it. Prepare units to fight maybe outnumbered and with certain disadvantages. You're going to have certain advantages, right? You're in the United States. We bring it all to bear. The Russians in in March, the Wagner Group, in March of 2018, they said, hey, I wonder what happens if you fire on a U.S. Special Forces and Ranger outpost. Huh. You know what happens? I mean, you get smoked is what happens. So nobody else can put it together like we can, but we can't be complacent about that.
Just trying to turn with some questions from cadets. Yeah, please come to the microphone. Nope. I'm gonna start with the first captain. Go ahead, first captain.
Sir, Cadet Vanderwall, Company B1. Thanks for being here tonight. I really enjoyed your comments. I wanted to go back to Rafa, specifically thinking about Israel. The basics of strategy that we learned at West Point is that strategy is the alignment of ends, ways, and means. Thinking about Israel going into Rafah, I see that more as of a course of action or a way, but how can we think about an end state for Israel? Like what are the possible options that they could consider in Gaza?
Thanks, Martin.
Okay. Hey, so I don't think Israel's thinking enough about the end state and how to organize it, but they're not getting a lot of help either, so it's difficult. It's really hard because of the degree to which there's estrangement between the Israelis and the Palestinians for them to be able to generate real partnerships with the Palestinians within Gaza. And by the way, guess who still has the guns? Hamas, even areas that have been cleared. So if you step forward and say, hey, I'll be the mayor of Gaza, what's your life expectancy going to be if you're not Hamas? Not very long. So they have some real dilemmas associated with trying to get to that sustainable political outcome I was describing. I think what they're thinking of in terms now is clear Rafah and clear routes, right? High-speed routes through Gaza that they can secure, and they can continue to raid against Hamas and keep Hamas down while they work with international entities to try to form somebody who's willing to be the mayor of Gaza. But that person has to have guns, right? And those guns can't be like some weak UNIFIL like the Southern Lebanon operation. It has to be a real peace enforcement mission. Could the Egyptians do it as a backbone? Yes. Do they want to do it? Hell no, they don't want to do it. So I think that's what it's going to take. I think it's easy to criticize the Israelis. Oh, they have no vision. But really, who's going to do it? That's why when they said we're going to have to occupy it for a while, I think they're going to have to occupy it for a while. Now, they don't want to occupy Gaza, but I think they're going to have to do it until some multinational force can come in. Secretary Blinken, I think, has done the best job he can to try to galvanize people to step up to do it. But there's a great deal of reluctance to own the problem, and then Hamas still is a danger, to the Palestinians there, as well as to anybody who would try to create an alternative political order.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Nate?
Sir, Cadet Geiger, Company A2, you mentioned several authors and thinkers. You kind of quoted them. Can you give us just a short list of some of the most influential writers that have shaped your thinking over the years? Okay.
All right. So I mentioned Michael Howard already. I would read the essay, The Use and Abuse of Military History. I'm sure we still teach that here. And any of his books are fantastic in terms of understanding war and warfare. I think, study war with depth and context. Read about personal experiences. What Michael Howard writes about is when you read about small unit tactical battles and actions, the tidy outlines of history disappear, right? And you see the desperation of battle, the human dimension of battle. I think the face of battle is good for that because it's in width, but it also is about battles that occurred over multiple centuries in the same geographic location. So you can see the differences. I think writers who take you from the tactical to the strategic and back are fantastic, like David Hackett Fisher on Washington's Crossing, or anything Rick Atkinson writes, like the Victory Trilogy, World War II, and what he's writing on the Revolution right now as well. Then you want to read surveys of wars and war experiences that again take you from the tactical to the strategic. McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, fantastic book. And then because it's not too soon to think, you have to think strategically, right? There's no strategy switch on your back that gets turned on when you're a colonel, And again, it's because you have to be able to connect what you're doing at the tactical level to what you're trying to achieve. So I think books that look at war strategy overall, I'm thinking of Gerhard Weinsberg's book, A World at Arms, World War II is in that genre. But then also critiques of failures, and things that didn't work out, Anyway, I could go on about it. Obviously, I've got to put a reading list back out there. We had, at the Maneuver Center when I was there, we called it the Maneuver Leaders Self-Study Program. And in it, you could pick strategy, you could pick tactical leadership, you could pick combined arms operations. And there was a reading list there and a program of self-study and a description of how you would go about studying that topic. Joe Byerly, if anybody of you know him, he worked on this with me. He's still on active duty. I'll try to find that and resurrect it, or if the history department can help me, if that's still around somewhere. I think it was a useful guide. We got a lot of hits on it, but a lot from foreign armies more than the United States. I mean, the biggest number of hits we got was from the Indian Army, because the chief of staff of the Indian Army said, if you want to learn about war, go to that self-study program. And then we had like, where do we get all these hits on the website? It was Indian Army officers.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Go over here.
Sir, Cadet Olson, Company A1, thank you so much for coming out to talk to us. Can you talk about how can the U.S. create trust with Russia through its actions in the modern battle space?
Yeah, okay. All right, so are you talking about like how to counter Russian new generation warfare as well as what they're doing conventionally, everything?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, so, hey, this goes to the theme of studying the past, right? So I was the director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center. How's that for a title? And essentially the job was to design the future Army. And so, hashtag predictable for an historian. I'm like, oh, why don't we study the wars that's going on right now to see if there are any lessons from that? So the study that we did in 2014 to 16, into 2014 to 16, was modeled on a study that General Don Starry, who was a phenomenal officer, a real visionary, and part of the renaissance that happened in the Army from the post-war Vietnam period into the 80s and into the 90s. He did a study of the 1973 war in Israel. And that study was a catalyst for a lot of the changes that occurred in Army doctrine, in leader development, in concept work, and in modernization. So I had the same kind of thing in mind. Hey, let's put this team together. We had physicists and historians and various types of military experts, scientists of different kinds. And they delivered a very solid study that we learned a lot about. And what we saw is that Russia had grafted a lot of new capabilities on some old capabilities. And they had combined really some old capabilities like massive electronic warfare, which they're still using to good effect in Ukraine, and massive artillery combined with drones. This was a forerunner of what we've seen the onslaught happening against Ukraine now. And it was not that sophisticated, like for us, like we try to be precise. They didn't really care back then about being that precise, I mean, they would throw a drone out, they would terrain associate. Oh, I think that's that units in that area, and they would take out the grid square with rockets and artillery, right? And but at the same time, they were engaged in a sophisticated campaign of political subversion, including assassination, but really cyber-enabled disinformation, information warfare against us. And so we delivered this study, and I hope the Army internalized that. As I was briefing the study on President's Day weekend in February 2017. I got a phone call to go interview for the job as National Security Advisor at Mar-a-Lago, so I kind of left it, abruptly. But okay, Russia. What does Russia do overall? China does co-option, coercion, and concealment. Right? Russia does disruption. First of all, disrupt you, right, with political subversion, with a massive attack, right, with the threat of an attack, with a coup in West Africa. With the enabling of the Assad regime in Syria, right? Disrupt, and then to really just deny. I call it implausible deniability. Well, that wasn't me that did whatever the hell it was, right? And then create dependencies, as they tried to do in Europe on gas and oil, for example. And I think what we have to do is take all of that apart. With Russia, I think what's really important is to sustain support for the Ukrainians in some critical areas. Tiered and layered air defense, everybody knows that. But you have to be able to kill the archer as well as shoot down the arrows, so long-range precision fires. We have to figure out how to cope with their electromagnetic warfare capability and help provide, especially terrestrial electromagnetic warfare capability, to counter drones. They need more and better systems to provide defense against the glide bombs in particular. That could be longer-range air defense, but there has to be an air defense shooting down that arrow capability for that as well. And then, of course, that's a range of capabilities for a military objective of stopping the onslaught against Ukrainians. Then what you need are a range of capabilities to defeat their ground offensive and then conduct a counteroffensive. And we know what that is, right? That's engineering capabilities, mobility capabilities in particular. It is mobile protected firepower. They have a real manpower issue on skilled infantry that is going to be critical. Excuse me. And then they need logistics. I mean, one of the things that I think I wish we had done, is not pull our advisors out, first of all, but if we could have formed like a civilian theater support command, which is this amazing organization, and help the Ukrainians with logistics and maintenance, and help us understand better the demands, like what they needed, I think that could have made a really big difference.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Here, please.
Sir, Cadet David Garcia, wanted to thank you for joining us tonight. My question, sir, so with Russia and China both increasing their military spending dramatically in the last 20 years, and our allies in Europe dramatically decreasing theirs, how can we encourage our European allies to return to investing in the military, and what role do they have in future conflicts?
Yeah. Okay, so burden sharing is a big issue, and if President Trump's reelected, I mean, that was one of his really areas of emphasis. Hey, I think that they have to come to their own conclusions, obviously. They've all made the whale pledge to spend at least 2%. I think that France is on track to meet that finally. But the countries that are investing that amount in defense are those who are right on the frontier with Russia. The Baltic states, sadly, their GDP is not that big, so it doesn't get you a whole bunch of military capability. Poland certainly is far exceeding. Poland, will go well over 3, maybe 3.5. And others like Romania, they're meeting their 2% pledge. I think that the UK is going to invest more. They just announced not enough probably, but Germany's been the one that's been lagging. And the reason why that's important is Germany has a huge GDP. If Germany rebuilds its defense after it really essentially unilaterally disarmed, then it could have a big impact on European security. The Chancellor Olaf Scholz talked about this Zeitenwende, this change and a realization that they're in a new era and they have to defend themselves, but they've been slow really in being able to deliver that. This is an important lesson for us though. When you dismantle a capability, it's really hard to build it back up. It's much easier and cheaper to maintain a capability. So I'm looking at what the Army did recently with cavalry squadrons and infantry brigade combat teams. How hard is it going to be, once you realize you have to do it, to regenerate that reconnaissance and security capability within it? It's going to be hard as hell, right? Once you get rid of it. So, I think that it's really important for us to recognize that when we're making force management decisions and so forth with our own capabilities.
So I'm going to go here, but this is going to be the last question. I apologize. What I would recommend you all do is write an email to Major Barsoon, and he'll answer it like he's General McMaster with your questions. Okay? Please.
Good evening, sir. Cadet Jackson, H3. On the topic of trying to learn from mistakes of the past, sir, the United States Army will continue to interact with civilian populations both during and after combat operations. Was the spiral that we witnessed in Afghanistan a direct result of a lack of continuity? Maybe perhaps like safety management moving to unmounted-only patrols?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a factor, right? The lack of continuity. But also, it was more than just a lack of continuity with special operations doing 6-month tours. That was mitigated to some extent, that they would do multiple 6-month tours and sometimes go back to the same place, but often not. But also, units that gained a lot of experience in one area of operation in Iraq or Afghanistan, they went to the other country, or they went to a different area. And so you couldn't rekindle those relationships oftentimes. It was like the Army staff at times was just trying to put patches on the map where they're supposed to go, without enough thought to continuity beyond the tour length, right? Which is, I think that's a good point too. So there are things you could do to provide more continuity. Part of it also was areas in which our gains had not been fully consolidated, such that there were capable and legitimate Iraqi or Afghan security forces in place that were capable of operating without our support. We often uncovered those areas completely based on just wanting to get out. And this is one of the things that I think they're learning the wrong lessons, for example. Conrad Crane, again, our colleague, who's a fantastic historian, and just fun person to be around. He came up with that phrase, 2 ways to fight asymmetrically and stupidly. But he also wrote a great essay called The Vietnam Syndrome. And in it, he makes the argument that we learned the wrong lesson in Vietnam. Like, we're just never going to do that again, right? Let's forget about that. Let's, as in part an emotional cathartic, leave Vietnam behind and focus on high-end war in Europe. And that's where you get air-land battle. General Don Starry, as I mentioned, goes to learn the lessons of the '73 war. But, pretty soon, we found ourselves in missions where you're intermingled with civilian populations, not just in Afghanistan in 2001 after the mass murder attacks of 9/11, but in Bosnia on a peace enforcement mission, for example, or in Somalia in a mission for humanitarian assistance which turned into a fight. So we are always going to be operating in and among the population. Understanding the social, the political, the historical, the cultural dynamics is always going to be important. Building relationships with people in those societies and polities. I'll tell you, 90% of what you need to know about an operation, somebody will tell you if you ask them, right? Now, oftentimes, people who tell you things are trying to influence you. You're going to get disinformation based on a various tribe or sect or the agenda associated with them. But over time, you can triangulate that. So being a good listener, bringing in cultural expertise. Hey, I'll just tell you quickly. When I got to Talafar, like our regiment did, out of the blue, we were in South Baghdad, right? We got moved up there. I called the history department, and I said, hey, do you have anybody at the history department who knows about Nineveh province? Yes, Captain Dan Bernard, who just finished his doctorate in Iraqi history and wrote his dissertation on the 1920 revolt against the British in Nineveh province. And so he sent us archival data and tribal maps and everything that were super relevant to our reconnaissance. And when I say reconnaissance, learning the area of operation broadly. And then, he came out. He flew out and helped our regiment win that fight. So, I'll tell you, I think that there's a tendency now, I think, to say, okay, we're never going to do that again in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're never going to have to be amongst the population, right? I mean, of course you are. Of course you are. So I think, buck that trend because what we don't want is our assumptions about future war to have us set up, for disappointment. Who would have thought, as Secretary Gates said, our former Secretary of Defense, he said, our track record for predicting the next war is perfect. It's 0%, right? So you just got to be prepared for a range of contingencies and certainly for operating in and among populations.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
So can we please give General McMaster a round of applause?
Thanks.
So very quickly, I will tell you that one of the things that's really special about West Point, if you're a cadet, and you will see this soon, is your connection to your faculty. It's very, very unique in higher education. It's very different. The amount of time that your faculty spends with you, the touch points you have with your faculty, and then the relationships you keep with your faculty. So Captain McMaster was a professor here when I was a history major as a cadet, and I worked for him as a lieutenant. And he has never, ever failed when I've asked him for help in any situation, whether that's a letter of recommendation, whether that's just asking for some wisdom, or actually helping in many, many different ways, including when he's been very, very busy. It is something I've always admired, and I've tried to model as best I can after him the same approach, which is to try to give back. And I think that is something that you should not dismiss about the incredible the incredible aspect of West Point is that connection. And sir, it's always been wonderful to have you as a mentor and a friend and a colleague and someone I can call when I need help on anything. So thank you again for being here. He has come and talked in many times in my life. One time when I was a major at the JAG school, and he'll show up whenever I ask, and he's a very busy man, so I'm very, very thankful, sir.
Hey, what a privilege.
And sir, on behalf of the Academy,
thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
We have a couple of things for you. If you look at his tie and his socks, he's all in. He's all in on West Point. So, sir, some Go Army, Beat Navy cups.
Awesome.
Of course.
Thanks. Thank you. Awesome.
And I have to give it to him. He was in the archives earlier today. This is the most recent publication from the West Point Press, The West Point Landscape, 1802 to 1860 by John Malinowski. And it is all came from the archives here at West Point. So again, sir,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, you guys, you're all dismissed.